Welcome back to the Big Sky Podcast Network Power Rankings, brought to you guys by Tubbs the Club, which means presented by Snake River Stampede Canadian Whiskey. I know the title is Power Rankings. We don't really give a shit about Power Rankings. This is just a show name. So Patty, we've got Patty in the house. Patty, glad to have you back. And this is all obviously talking Big Sky podcast, Big Sky. But all we care about is really playoff related stuff. So we're going to talk about the week in the Big Sky, some quick reactions to a few games, the games we have to come and how that matters. And then we'll talk about playoff stuff after. Our playoff talk is going to transcend the Big Sky a little bit because realistically for seeding, there are some non-Big Sky games to pay attention to. And for NAU, whether the Lumberjacks are going to get in, well, there's some non-Big Sky news that we have to talk about as well. But Patty, just before we get to the games, you were there for the Eastern game, which means I'm going to talk. I don't want to give that away too early, but you can't have had that rough of a sports weekend this week.
Yeah, it was a fun weekend. So I made it to, 5 different sporting events and different separate games in 3 days, between 2 football games on Saturday, 2 basketball games today, and a volleyball game Friday. So back's a little sore from sitting in bleachers, but yeah, it's been a fun weekend. Eastern put up 77 points, set a bunch of division. It's like the most points Eastern's ever scored against a Division I opponent in school history. That was pretty damn as close as you could get to perfect offensively for Eastern Washington. They had like 470 yards on the ground, didn't throw an incompletion.
I'm going to pause you there. I'm going to pause you there because we got to get to that in the actual game. But anyway,
it was crazy.
You've had a lot of rough weekends this football season. This was not one of them.
Yeah, it was nice.
Okay, we're actually going to talk about that game right off the bat, just because I think that there is some takeaway in Big Sky world. So to hit it briefly, that's first game we'll talk about. Idaho State at Eastern. I thought this game was worth paying attention to because if Idaho State pulls off a win, it guarantees that the Bengals finish at 500 for the first time in a long time. And that did not happen. Eastern won 77-42. Astounding to think Idaho State could hang 42 points on Eastern and lose by 5 touchdowns. But I cut you off after I say one thing. Like, you're right. Eastern goes 15 for 15 passing the ball. 1, obviously, you guys can handle that math. That's no incompletions. 2, Eastern scored 77 points and threw the ball 15 times. Now, Patty, back to you talking Eastern. The only reason I'm talking about this game for the reaction is because it's such a goddamn weird box score to see. What'd you see, Patty?
Yeah, that was insane. I have one thing to say. That was the worst defensive performance I think I have ever seen from both teams, but from Idaho State in particular, that had to be the worst defensive performance I've ever seen from a Division I football team. 77 points, not even forcing a single incompletion. 478 yards on the ground by Eastern Washington. They were running like 5 and 6 man boxes all the way till halftime, and then they started coming out in heavier boxes, and it still wasn't stopping Eastern. That was pretty damn impressive. It was pretty dang. I can't believe how bad it was by Idaho State, but it's not like this game had a ton of implications or anything, but that was just one of the craziest games I've ever been to. Just like, if I'm a defensive guy at heart, and so I'm sitting here the whole game, I was just laughing at how bad the defense was from either side. 77-42 is just obnoxious, but that's all I got on that game. It was crazy.
No, and hey, just a quick takeaway is I still think Idaho State's not in like the bottom tier of the Big Sky, but I also think you can't leave this game thinking that. I mean, I just think of the opportunity Eastern probably squandered on the year. That's not a talent-free football team. We've kind of covered that exhaustively on this show, like just some inept defensive stuff, in some games, some kind of weird offensive decisions, particularly how long to leave Vesperis in. And I say how long because Vesperis is a good quarterback. He's had a lot of good games this year, but as you've talked about, there are times where Vesperis has been pulled, And then he's pulled so Jared Taylor can go out there for a few runs, and then he comes back in, the rhythm's jacked up. So just kind of the button for me is Eastern. Look, if Eastern gets a new coach next year, if they do, I think this is a team that's getting. I would pencil Eastern today with the new coach in the playoffs in 2025 over Idaho State in 2025, even with continuity at Idaho State and the obvious improvement you're seeing with Cody Hawkins there. Moving on. I want to talk about one really sad game for 10 seconds too. Sacramento State loses 26-23 to Cal Poly. Sacramento State has one Big Sky win. They've got 3 wins on the season. Cal Poly now has 2 Big Sky wins. Like 4th string quarterback for Cal Poly, Jackson Atkins, is the guy who runs the show. 305 yards, 2 touchdowns. I guess I don't understand exactly what happened to Sac State on the year. Defensively, they fell apart, and then offensively, it's weird. Like we talked, Patty, a lot about, hey, like I think Sac State needs to coalesce around an identity, and that meant quarterback, because how the team operated, depending on whether it's Caden Bender or Carson Conklin, really did change what Sac did offensively. But minus a couple games, like Sac just never really got it together. If you took away the preseason rankings Sacramento State had, I think for half the season we would have just said like, well, yeah, they're just not very good. But hey, any takeaways you have from Sac State going down to Cal Poly?
I just gotta say, like, Andy Thompson, man, you inherited a Big Sky championship level team year after year after year, and in 2 years at the helm, this team is losing to Cal Poly, is ripe to finish dead last in the Big Sky. Like, that is insane. Like, I know, like, my school is taking a pretty hard nosedive from where it was, but that is insane. Like, just the 2-year turnaround is nuts. And it doesn't feel like the talent's the problem there. It's really confusing, because when you look at Sac State against I get like lesser competition earlier in the year, it looked like, oh, this is a top 25 team. It's a pretty good team.
Lesser competition that we would probably say, like, for example, like, hey, if Nichols and Cal Poly were playing, like, I think if we were picking that game, we'd probably struggle. Like, hey, who are we going to pick? Well, Sac State beat Nichols 34-7 to start out the year.
Yeah. I don't fully understand why it's been like this, but the last 2 years under Andy Thompson, like, Sac State has just finished poorly. Like, they come into the year, they seem to look good. Like, last year they had the Stanford win. They look good. They get good looks, and then just down the stretch, it just seems like for whatever reason they just give away games. Like last year, they ended the year on it felt like 4 straight losses, and then they go to the playoffs and win a game all of a sudden, and then they lose, and coming to the year they look good again, and then they're back down on this downward trajectory. I don't know what the deal is there. It's tough. It reminds me of Eastern, because it's like that team has talent on it. Like, there's guys there. It's just what's happening. I don't understand it.
I mean, look, they only have 1 conference win, so obviously there's a lot of losses here. But, you know, Sac State's going to close with, in all likelihood, 5 consecutive conference losses in a run of 5 games that also includes Idaho State, Portland State, and Cal Poly. And hey, like we just talked about Idaho State, that they are moving. They're not bottom tier of the Big Sky, but I mean, like Patty, if I told you that's how Eastern was going to close the season out with those 5 games, you'd probably say, like, okay, well, whatever. We're going to have some momentum to close the season out, like rough start, but you know, there's worse things than picking up wins in 3 of your last 5 games. Ron in the comment section saying coaching matters. Yeah, and then TJ the Big Dog saying, on any level, coaching is a big factor. Ron, Sac State isn't ready for the Pac-12. That's the other thing that's just been weird, was how there was that very public push to move up. And we both know, and lots of our listeners know, moving classification, and this is not a realignment show today, guys, just FYI, but we all know moving up classifications doesn't actually have that much to do with wins and losses, and more the metropolitan area that your university happens to reside within and the perceived TV market, regardless of capitalization on that market. It's just a fact of the market. That's why that discussion even exists in Sacramento. But doing that, then winning one Big Sky game, yeah, a little bit odd. Moving on though, because again, like the story just Sac State is more like a good God, how'd you guys do it? You're gonna sprint through. We got to talk about Northern Arizona only because this matters for playoff purposes. Northern Arizona took care of business at Northern Colorado, as many teams have a way of doing. Northern Arizona beat Northern Colorado 44-3, and now NAU, they've got to win. They got to win their game this week against Eastern. It's at home. We'll talk about that later. NAU is set to close the year on a 4-game winning streak, which if Ty Pennington was back against Montana State, well, actually rephrase, 5-game winning streak if NAU picks up the win this week. Realistically, we'd be talking about like a 6-game winning streak if Ty Pennington had been eligible, if he'd been able to play against Montana. He was out with concussion. But Patty, your thoughts on NAU taking care of business in that final month of the season to do what they can to stay playoff eligible?
Right, they've been doing what they need to do. They're winning games that they need to win. They lost. I mean, they lost to Montana and they lost to Idaho, and they avoided both Davis and Montana State. Pretty favorable schedule for them.
Correct.
And when you look around the landscape of the FCS, we've been saying, like, if they win out, they can make the playoffs, but they need help. Well, this week they got that help from other teams around the country. So 2 pretty important bubble teams in the Southern Conference this week lost games. Chattanooga came in; they were a 4-loss SoCon team. If they win out, which with their schedule it looked like they were gonna, they're probably a shoe-in playoff team. They got kind of their butts kicked by Stanford at home. And then you have East Tennessee State, ETSU, a team that took North Dakota State down to the wire at the beginning of this year. They also lost their matchup. I can't remember who they played, but they got beat. I think they got beat by Furman, actually. Maybe I'm forgetting who it was, but they lost their game.
East Tennessee State lost to Furman.
Yeah, so both of those teams were. I mean, East Tennessee State had basically the exact same resume as Northern Arizona. Like, they had one sub D1 win, a couple high quality losses, and the same number of wins. Now that they have lost, they're probably out of the playoff picture. That's 2 teams that were probably just slotted ahead of NAU that are no longer there. Another team that was really close to giving it away was Eastern Kentucky. They're now I believe they're 7-4 right now. If they win next week, they'll be 8-4, a team that probably gets slotted into the playoffs right ahead of NAU. They went to overtime this week and won a game by 3 at Austin Peay. So Eastern Kentucky is if you're a Lumberjack fan, you have to win this week. But if a team like Eastern Kentucky loses as well, you're starting to feel pretty dang good about your chances of getting in this week. But I mean, you got to beat Eastern, who is coming in with some momentum.
Which, we'll talk about that game later. We're going to talk about the rest of our kind of deep dive implications on the playoff later, Patty. But since we're here, to further contextualize what Patty was saying, hey, we all know that NAU, if they win out, they'll have 8 total. That'll be 8 total wins on the year, but only 7 will be D1 because Lincoln should honestly be a subtraction of a win. Now, if you're new to the FCS playoff understanding, hey, a sub D1 win, it's not thought of as nothing, but it's thought of as less than a complete win, which is say if you're looking at NAU compared to other 8-win teams, you could think, I'd say hey, think of NAU as being a 7.5 win team or a 7 1/3 of a win team based on who Lincoln is. But what Patty's bringing up with East Tennessee State and Chattanooga, depending on what source you're looking at, NAU has been routinely put on a first 4 out list by guys like Sam Herder for the last handful of weeks. And the big thing was like I talked about, Chattanooga and East Tennessee State. Those 2 teams were both considered last 4 in. So those 2 teams picking up losses and NAU taking care of business can give the committee the chance to overlook that sub D1 win And hey, NAU is going to have a strong strength of schedule based off being in the Big Sky. So we'll talk more about the matchup with Eastern later. But hey, TJ, the Big Dog 11, glad that you're here. That's the situation for NAU. NAU needed help. They've got it from the bottom, those bottom teams in the potential playoff picture. Patty, I do not think they're going to get any more help from East Kentucky, because Eastern Kentucky plays North Alabama, who has 3 wins next week. So these bubble teams do have a way of losing games. However, if you're East Kentucky, like, this is the dream matchup to not, trip on your dick on the way out of the season. Moving on now to a couple other games that did matter. First, one last on the NAU thing. Something that's really emerged for the Lumberjacks. Freshman running back Seth Cromwell has just been kicking ass the last couple games. Now, granted, it's against Cal Poly in Northern Colorado, so we do get to actually look at who they're playing and see how that matters. But over those last 2 games, Cromwell with 32 carries for 287 yards and 4 rushing touchdowns, averaging just under 9 yards per carry. That's a late game surge to TJ, the Big Dog 11, that I'm pretty sure you guys are happy with. All right, other games that we can talk about this week. Well, I was going to try to blow through one, but let's talk about Montana, Portland State just for like 10 seconds, Patty, because Montana picked up their 8th win. So they're probably in the playoffs there. Kind of the story of this game was what Bobby Houck still just jacking around quarterbacks in a way that, like, it just seems so. It's almost like the dude's trying to become a caricature of himself. Starts Kealili Ayat, who is just terrible in the first half. I don't think Montana scored in the first half at all. So they're losing at home to top 5 Portland State in a must-win game, because the Grizz are going to lose this week for sure. Logan Fife comes in, and of course the offense just starts humming right away, because Logan Fife is the perfect fit for what Montana wants to do offensively. There's a little skirmish on the sideline between Fife and Houck that made some news, but also the two also made up like 10 seconds later. And hot take, I actually expect this will help Fife, because Houck is kind of like a hardcore alpha who will respect someone standing up to him, but then coming back and initiating, like building the bridge. Houck, of course, didn't do it. It was Fife who initiated that. But I actually think that'll be good for Montana and maybe increase his chance of being the starter, because that's how Houck's weird like that, but he's won a shit ton, so it works, right? So I don't know, like it's weird, like Ron says. Ron's saying Bobby Houck almost assaulted his own QB and calls him the F-bomb. I actually didn't see Houck look like any. So I think that's a little over dramatic. It was an assistant coach who put his hand on Fife. But like, he pushed the guy away when Fife was the one being animated, and what I'd say is a little bit too aggressive. So like, I'm not like, I know because there's physical contact. There was like the internet was on fire for that for a while. I actually thought it was handled fine. It's just more the optics of a quarterback and a coach yelling at each other is the weird thing. But Patty, look, Montana's not going to get a first round bye in playoffs. We know that. But hey, your takeaway from this week with Montana?
Right. It's just the quarterback carousel has been weird. The defense actually looked better. They didn't give up a million points, which they've been doing on a pretty consistent basis this year, aside from Northern Colorado, Cal Poly. So that's like a positive sign if you're a Grizz. The negative sign is just the stubbornness with Ayad and that whole situation. But like you said, like with that whatever the confrontation was on the sideline, after that, like the Grizz offense seemed to just kind of open up and just look good again. Like Fife came onto the field. Like I don't think he really did anything in the first half. He comes on the field in the second half.
He didn't take a snap in the first half.
That's right. Yeah. And he came back on in the second. He came on in the second half and looked pretty dang good. So that, combined with a few passing comments I heard from Bobby Houck talking about I figured out how to fire him up. Things are going to get ugly on the sideline next week in the first quarter. Like, obviously it probably doesn't mean anything, but it sounds like they might be leaning towards Fife as a starter. I would think, especially, didn't Ayat get hurt? I think
I don't know. I didn't see if he got hurt. I know that, it just feels like there is some other math going on about why Ayat's playing, because results certainly don't indicate this being a competition. But the results on the field haven't indicated it being competition for a while. So my hot take speculation is, I don't know if they're concerned about if Ayat doesn't play at all, like that he might transfer. So their math is like, hey, we'll just keep him playing some, so he stays engaged here. He's a legacy guy who the Montana probably really loves the idea of Kealili Ayat doing well. He's the son of Brian Ayat, former Grizz great. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if it's something like that, because we are in the world where if you don't like how things are going, you can transfer.
Right.
And even though his numbers didn't light the world on fire, Ayat would most certainly find a landing spot without much difficulty at a similar Big Sky level, I think. So I don't know if some of it's that. I don't know if it's just the fact of him being a legacy is part of why. But I feel that when it's confusing like this, it's because everyone has the same opinion. There's some other reason that Ayat keeps getting a shot. I don't know if it's also just because, hey, Ayat did win the job in camp, then got hurt. So it also could be trying to signal that you're not going to for sure lose your spot right away because of injury, but it's dragged on to me further than that justifies.
Yeah, I agree.
Kind of like our talk about Montana today has dragged on a little bit further than things justify. So next few games, Weber State at Idaho. Idaho beats Weber State 31-24. Idaho was completely dominating defensively in this game for like 90% of the game. Still held Weber to like around 300 total yards. Weber didn't pick up their 7th first down until their second to last drive of the game. Idaho did have a little bit of offensive struggles early, or it was kind of this evolution of 3-and-out parade the first quarter. Then Idaho's driving every time to 30 and stalling out. And then in the second, and a little bit into the third quarter, second half, Idaho, things started to click. However, Idaho did take the points most of the time when they made their drives into the 30. That's part of why Idaho held on to the game. And Jack Lane, the QB1 for Idaho, made the start, threw for 287 yards and 3 touchdowns. Wide receiver Mark Hamper had just a video game box score. 8 catches for 187 total yards and 3 touchdowns. Patty, your takeaways.
Right. It was a weird game, but I also feel like 31-24 makes it look a little bit closer than it like Idaho had a 2 touchdown lead pretty late in the fourth quarter. Then 2 of Idaho's DBs ran into each other before the ball got to someone, and it was a long breakaway touchdown. I gave up
a 50-yard touchdown on that. It was KJ Trujillo and Kyron Beacham. Either of them should have picked off the pass, but the 2 took each other out. Yeah. So the ball ended up threading through the 2 Vandals, colliding into each other to a wide open Jacob Strong. I believe it's Jacob Strong for the touchdown. But anyway, I'm with you on this. Idaho's had actually 4 or 5 games like this where the final score makes it feel like the game was closer than it actually was. I don't see an actual thread connecting those various games. There's a fumble return for a touchdown against Cal Poly. That was just kind of weird. Here we have that weird pass play that had it been a pick, we're saying, well, this is nail in the coffin on a blowout. So I don't know. My big takeaway for Idaho is with Jack Lane under center, Idaho's a different team. This is now Idaho last in 2023 with all the big names that Vandals at least remember. Didn't break 30 points after the first week of October. This Vandal team's broken 30 the last 3 games. So this was a team that struggled to score for most of the year. Now, Jack Lane started 2 of those 3 games where Idaho's been breaking 30. Sure, they're against some of the not as great defenses in the league, but what I take this as is Idaho's defense is starting to kind of click again, where they were great the first 3 or 4 weeks. There's a little bit of up and down stuff, mostly I think correlated with injuries. And now they spent a few weeks where they've had halves where they're kicking ass, but not whole games. I feel like the defense has turned the corner right when the offense finally has turned the corner. And I just think that makes this Idaho team far more dangerous than what we saw early in the season. But hey, when you're starting a 3rd string quarterback, you shouldn't look too dangerous offensively. That's funny how that goes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So hey, before we shift to the game, anything else you want to hit on Idaho?
To me, this feels like a game that other Idaho teams lose. that there's been that game every year, at least the last 2 years under Jason Eck, and it was a pattern when he was at South Dakota State too, where like they just drop a game that they this absolutely should not have dropped. To me, this felt like the game and that chance, and it didn't happen. And like they withstanded some adversity and things went well for them. I think they have some positive momentum. Obviously, you got to get past Idaho State, but you have some positive momentum now. Looking into, hey, you win next week, first round bye, and you're probably up there. I'd have to say at least a 6 seed, right? And we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but
yeah,
like I think things are looking good in Moscow as long as you can take care of business next week, which we keep saying, but as long as you take care of business, this is a top 8 seed for sure.
Yeah. Last game, the Big Sky Conference Championship, assuming things hold this week. Montana State at UC Davis. And the rhythm of this game was odd, where like, hey, Davis scores first, then Montana State rips 20 in a row. Looks like they're going to blow away Davis. But then Davis fights back, and they're a 2-point conversion away from this being an OT game. Final score 30-28. And just a couple things I think they're worth paying attention to here in the box score. For some of the middle of the game, actually, Montana State was relying on Tommy Malotte's arm, and he was delivering 18-25 for 174 yards, passed for 2 touchdowns. Davis, relative to teams who play Montana State, did the best at bottling up Montana State on the ground of any team this entire season. Yep. Cats still rushed for 159 yards on 34 carries, but only 1 rushing touchdown. So that actually is, to me, is that's impressive. No one else has been that good against Montana State on the ground. And then on the UC Davis end, I mean, look, they had everything go for the Aggies had everything going for them offensively. They needed to potentially pull off this upset. And I'm calling it upset. I thought the Cats were going to win by 2 touchdowns. Miles Hastings throws for 320 yards and 3 touchdowns. Lan Larison rushes for 112 yards on 23 carries, also 109 receiving yards. Still isn't quite enough. So I know my takeaway from this was I thought that Montana State was a different kind compared to Davis. This is also based off having seen Idaho play Davis. But I think maybe the takeaway is Davis has been – they had some injury issues earlier. Like you were right on top in early season, Patty, talking about the Connors brothers missing some time really hurt Davis defensively. But I think Davis is like Idaho in a different way, that they're playing their best ball to close out the season. I wouldn't say this is a demerit against Montana State. They won the game. They're gonna finish undefeated. Yeah. But I think Davis showed up more than what essentially anyone who follows the Big Sky who does not reside in Sacramento probably picked Montana State to win healthily. And this was pretty damn tight, and Davis was able to impose their will in some of the ways they need to offensively.
You know, Davis, I think, in the same way that, like you said, like Idaho's a different team this late in the year, Davis seems to have hit another gear, in my opinion. Like some of the issues, like we saw early when they played like Southern Utah, and I think they played Commerce early in the year, or East Texas A&M now. Like, you know, they could not punch it in the red zone, and that has not been a problem since conference play started. That hasn't been an issue for them. Like they've been creative enough in their scheming to be able to punch the ball in the end zone, and Hastings has been good enough. To me, the difference in this game was the turnovers. Davis turned the ball over twice in this game, as well as gave up a punt return touchdown to Montana State. When you clean up those mistakes, I think Davis wins this game. Like, that's what it felt like to me, at least. Davis outgained the Bobcats 416 yards to 330. Like, a lot of things went well for UC Davis. It was just the mistakes killed them, and that is something that Miles Hastings had. The two turnovers were, I think it was a fumble and a pick by him. So it's like it's a thing that has been a problem for Hastings in the past that happened again. But also we saw the really good sides of Hastings in this game as well. So looking forward, I think, I think at the start of the year, we thought there was like this massive ocean between Montana State and the rest of the Big Sky. I think that has closed less in the fact that Montana State just isn't as good as we thought. I think it's more UC Davis and frankly Idaho have turned kind of really improved themselves as the year has gone on, whether it be getting guys back from injury, getting the Connors brothers healthy, kind of figuring out what they need to do defensively and offensively to, be successful, find that identity. I think both those teams have done that. And looking forward, the Big Sky conference that we felt was down a little bit this year, like they have a chance to have 3 top 5 seats.
Yeah, and hey, Ron in the comments saying, never take your foot off the gas. The Bobcats got too conservative. Hey, I'll buy that. But I just think to me, the jury is in that, like you said, Patty, this isn't a put down to Montana State. People like myself thought Montana State was going to kill Davis because I watched Montana State murder Idaho and just look like they were a different level of good. I don't think that team's vanished by any means. In fact, if anything, I think they're probably, because of like at the running back position being a little healthier than the Bobcats were early in the year, they're probably still just fine. It's more like you said, Davis had some issues we highlighted on the show earlier in the year, and credit to Plow, Coach Tim Plow at UC Davis. Credit to the players at Davis. They're one of the teams that throughout the year they just got better. So, Patty, I cannot tell if that's laughter or if that is an inability to breathe that we have going on here, because it's kind of up and down.
Yeah, we're coughing. One second.
Okay, that's fine. Just put it on mute. So, with that said, Montana State's now, they're likely going to finish undefeated with wins in the Big Sky over Idaho, soon to be Montana, and UC Davis. So the Cats are in line to have Big Sky wins over 3 Big Sky playoff teams, plus that win earlier in the year over New Mexico, who New Mexico picked up their 5th win this week, beating Washington State. So it's pretty hard to get into a better resume than Montana State has. Before we finish our playoff talk, Patty, let's just slam through the implications for games next week. Hey, you guys all know Montana State, Montana, that game. Obviously, what that means for Montana State is trying to put a slam dunk on a number 1 seed. And there aren't other games I think that you could really take away from Montana State here. If Montana State wins and does so convincingly, I don't know how you couldn't say Montana State has not only the resume, but just like, the eye test, having passed the eye test to be a number 1 or 2 seed. No losses, FBS wins over 3 playoff teams out of the Big Sky. Some of, at least one of those will be on the road. It's hard to do better than that, Patty. Yeah. And then, hey, Montana, we all know Montana's not going to beat Montana State. They don't have the defense to do that. Absolutely no prayer. I know, like, hey, weird stuff happens in rivalry games. I'll tell you what does not happen in rivalry games. A team that has not stopped the run the entire year doesn't magically stop the run against the best rushing team in the nation. So, I just think the implications of this game are pretty straightforward. The Grizz have already done what they can do for their playoff resume, and the Bobcats are trying to slam home a number 1 seed, plus hosting all the way through the semifinals. So long as the Bobcats win, there's no way they're worse than a 2 seed, right, Patty?
Yeah, if they win convincingly, they have a legitimate case to the 1 seed nationally. They have the same number of ranked wins as a North Dakota State team. They have higher seeded ranked wins than the North Dakota State team, and they have the FBS win to go along with that. It would be, if you put the 2 resumes next to each other, I think Montana State is the number 1. But will that happen? It's hard to take NDSU down a notch after they have been the 1 seed all year.
Here's the pushback I have. In North Dakota State, based off the rankings released on October 30th from the playoff committee, is the number 1 seed. Yeah. So you are right. North Dakota State has not lost since then. But what Montana State – sorry, say that again.
And the thing is, like, NDSU has been dominant ever since then too. It's not like they've played, close games other than the South Dakota State game, which it's hard to knock them off that number one spot, which is where I would say like they're probably gonna stay at one, even though I think Montana State probably actually has a better resume on paper.
To me, like the case for the Cats here over, and hey, there is no case for Montana State at 3. If they pick up a win this week in Montana, there's no world where South Dakota State should jump them with 2 losses. And like, hey, yes, like they're two okay losses if you're a Jackrabbit, Oklahoma State and North Dakota State, those, and losing by 4 to North Dakota State. But the Bobcats will have picked up 2 pretty important playoff level wins. So that's where I'd say like, hey, maybe that's the case, but I think you're probably the safest thing to expect is, hey, if both those teams they're number 1 and 2 in the initial rankings and neither lose a game and both look good pretty much week in, week out, probably nothing changes. And for all intents and purposes, I don't think it really matters being 1 versus 2. You're on the opposite side of the bracket. You're hosting through the semis. You don't know how the bracket's going to shake out at this point. Sometimes it actually might be advantageous to be on the 2 side. The big deal is both teams are going to be hosting through the entire tournament till the championship, assuming the Bobcats win, which they will. Next game's I'm just going to talk playoff games, guys, because like hey, what's the implication of Cal Poly and Weber? I mean, there are if you're a fan, but like for the purpose of the show, I don't think they matter that much. We talked NAU a lot, so we can be briefer talking NAU Eastern. NAU's got to win this game to give themselves this is the last step of taking care of business. They've had the right breaks from some of the right teams, and I say teams plural. That's a big deal to have it be multiple teams that NAU got breaks from, because now things don't necessarily have to just be complete dumb luck to sneak in to get that single last spot. Your thoughts this week on Eastern NAU?
All right, I think this is probably a pretty competitive, close game. I think Eastern has played everyone on their schedule pretty dang tight. Like they competed with Montana State for 3 quarters. They competed with felt like probably should have beat Montana, competed with UC Davis, competed with Idaho. So you gotta think that this is going to be a pretty competitive game. NAU will be favored in this game, but also Eastern of the shared opponents, like Eastern, NAU barely sneaked by Idaho State in Flagstaff earlier this year, and Eastern killed them at home. You've got to wonder. Obviously, the transitive property isn't like it's not a thing in college football, but
it's not infallible. Let's say.
Right, but I mean that's got to mean something. Obviously, it's a different matchup. Idaho State and Eastern are about as opposite as it gets, like offensive approach. But I think this is a competitive game from snap to snap, and I think if NAU, if anyone looks past this game at all, obviously it's the end of the season. There's not a ton to look past, but if NAU is thinking about what seed they're going to get or something stupid like that, they're going to get. They could easily get beat by Eastern Washington. The Eastern's a good team, and when you look at the kind of stylistic matchup, like NAU's run defense hasn't been the strength of their defense, and Eastern is number 2 in the conference at running the ball, and they're fresh off of 2 300+ yard rushing performances.
I need to give you a pushback on that, which I'm sure what you'll say is like, hey, agree part way, disagree part way. Do you know who the number 1 rushing defense is in Big Sky play?
I believe it should be Montana State still.
It is not. It is not. It is your Northern Arizona Lumberjacks, giving up 5 rushing touchdowns on the year, 4 yards per rush, 830 total rushing yards allowed through 7 games. Now the caveat: NAU avoided Montana State. NAU also avoided UC Davis, and NAU got Idaho without Jack Lane. And yes, I know Jack Lane's not a running back, but when you can pass the ball the way Idaho can with Lane, that completely changes what teams have to do prep for defensively and what they can and cannot key on. Does that observation at all change your initial thoughts? on
So
NAU Eastern?
no, because like they haven't played like the three most run heavy teams in the conference are Montana State, weirdly Portland State, and Eastern, and they haven't played any of those teams.
Weber's up there too. Weber's
I
the
guess
number 3 Russian team in the nation. Or
Weber's
sorry,
up
not
there
nation, in the conference, not nation.
in the conference, right?
Yeah.
I it doesn't necessarily change how I feel about it. I think it's going to be a really close game either way. I think the matchup is favorable for Eastern if they're not I don't think they're the better team coming into this, but
Ryan Phillips saying Eastern's the Jake Paul, the Big Sky. Well, actually, NAU would kind of be the Jake Paul, the Big Sky in this matchup based off picking up a bunch of W's while avoiding teams at their peak, Ryan. But yeah, Ryan, I made the mistake of watching that fight. And like an idiot, I didn't even wait to just like fast forward through later on. So like, because it's on Netflix, I kept checking back and forth is when's it on? Honestly, because Ryan, I'm probably like a lot of if we have listeners who watch Tyson Paul, they're all probably like me, like they just want to see Jake Paul get his ass kicked. But like Tyson's 58, man. So we're all just morons for checking it in the first place. Back to the actual game. So I think the matchup is interesting it's a contrast in styles in some ways. Because I don't disagree with your premise that like it's hard. Like I don't think NAU's the best rushing defense in the Big Sky, but like you play who you play and you do what you do. It's not bullshit that NAU has held teams pretty damn well on the ground. 5 rushing touchdowns on the Big Sky season is pretty good. But Eastern you got to ignore the record when you're looking at Eastern. That is a talented team. They can score on anyone. That includes Idaho. That includes Montana State. So I guess your question is, do you think NAU's defense is at the level of Montana State and Idaho? Because that's kind of what you need to keep Eastern in check enough. With the other part being Eastern doesn't stop anyone, and NAU's not awful offensively. So I think those two things are essentially going to cancel each other out. I think NAU is not going to be able, they'll stop Eastern more than Idaho State did, because so would anyone. But I also think they're going to score relatively well. I just think this is going to be a tight, close game. I have no idea how to pick this game, honestly. This is a 100% coin flip game. Eastern feels like they have some momentum to close the season out, but Eastern's also been a hot, cold team, and hot, cold teams don't tend to like win. They don't tend to show up hot every time. It's not shocking to come out flat after just a complete ass kicking one week either. So I'm kind of leaning NAU just because NAU's hosting, but whatever. It's a tight game. We've hit that for playoff implications. Other games that matter for playoffs. Well, we got Idaho State. Idaho just needs to win. They're going to get a bye. We'll see what that means seed wise. It's going to be a sellout in Pocatello, so like the game will be cool in that sense. The environment will be cool. Idaho State feels like they're just not. They don't have defensively what they need to match up against Idaho, especially with Jack Lane at quarterback, which he will. Lane will be starting at quarterback. Your thoughts on Idaho State?
Yeah, I it's kind of an interesting matchup because, Idaho's defense has had some issues in the secondary, and all Idaho State does is throw the ball. But also,
kind of. Idaho they've been running around 33 to 40% of the time. I only bring that up because last year they ran like 4 times the entire year.
Yeah, it's not like last year, but that they get the vast majority of their yardage to the air is what I should say, I guess.
Yeah.
And that's how they want to win games. That's how Idaho has been more exposed in defensively anyways. I think it's an interesting matchup, as in like this is your classic like more of a defensive focused team. They ball possession, they like to run the ball, usually lower powered offense, good defense. And then you have Idaho State that's just, I just want to score more points than you. I have, for whatever reason, as a fan of a school that used to be that high-flying offense, like that just wants to outscore you, when you play a good defense and a team that can run the ball, like Idaho has struggled, but they're going to be able to run the ball in Idaho State because Idaho State can't stop anyone. The running team usually wins those games. For whatever reason, especially when it's close, the running team just imposes their will late in that game and wins. And that's the only reason that I think, well, not the only reason, but that's why I think Idaho wins this game. Is just I just think, one, they have the better defense, and I think they're gonna be able to run the ball kind of at will. The question here is Idaho gonna have more than one healthy running back at the start of that game? Because two of Idaho's three healthy running backs, semi-healthy running backs, at least available last week, were not able to finish the game. So will they have enough running backs to actually finish the game? We don't know.
You're, by the way, you're absolutely right with that. Idaho has been without Elisha Cummings for like around a month. Nate Thomas had been gone for around a month. Art Williams had kind of been the number 3, then the new number 1, but at number 3. Then Day Buchanan, a very, very highly thought of recruit to Idaho's redshirt freshman. He rushed last 2 weeks ago for over 200 yards against Portland State. Well, he left the game against Weber on crutches, not putting weight on his right leg. Came back standing on crutches on the sideline with a cast/brace around his right lower leg. Those I'm the person who saw that. So yeah, Idaho running back health, real question. Now the good news is Idaho trusts Jack Lane. And Lane can also pick teams apart in those short to intermediate passes that it's not the same as rushing the ball, but it can de facto turn into, hey, your drives are a little bit longer, so you still get to milk that time off the clock. That, and I just don't think Idaho State has the defense at all to slow down what Idaho can do now that Lane's back. And I think Idaho defensively agree that the pass is where Idaho's been more susceptible. That often is kind of like in the first half, and then like the Idaho will change things up in the second half. We've actually seen that itself kind of repeat about 4 or 5 times this season, where Idaho plays really like a ton of cover 4, like a lot of zone in the first half, and then they become a little more aggressive in the second half. I'm really curious if we actually see that rhythm in the first half against Idaho State, which would kind of potentially give them the kind of life to make it a game, because it will be a sellout. This is kind of Idaho State's Super Bowl. Idaho is getting into that rivalry, but Idaho State is really the ones buying in hardcore, which is great news. I think the Big Sky needs more games where people are excited about. I don't get off on pretending teams are not rivals. I think that's actually like a complete waste of time. I don't know why anyone would want to pretend to not have more fun at a game when you can. Like you talk about like, hey, root for chaos, watch football, have fun. Look, if you care about a game more than another game, to me, that means it's a rival of some type. If parsing that really matters to you, then I don't know, get a master's degree in English, focus on that, and skip football. I don't know. So other playoff games, the playoff considerations, we got UC Davis at Sacramento State. Are you concerned about this at all? Do you think there's any prayer of a bounce back game for Sac for more than a half?
What's annoying for me about Sac State is every time I look at their roster, I'm like, dude, these guys are good. Like, they're good players, but it's just they just give games away. I don't understand it. Would it be shocking to me if this game is a lot closer than it should be? No. Davis kind of has they already have a little bit of a pattern to maybe come out a little slow after a big game. We've seen that twice this year now. After the Idaho game, they went to Portland State and got behind a lot. After a big win at Montana, they came to Montana State and got behind by a lot.
Like half an inch away from losing to Portland State.
Yep, probably should have lost to Portland State, but they have that habit, so it would not shock me if Sac State came out. This is kind of Sac State Super Bowl this year, right now, at least in this point in the season. And if anything could happen. The thing that Davis has going for them, one, they're just a way better team, but two, like Davis has just owned this rivalry the last couple of years. It feels like I feel like 2 out of the last 3 years, like Sac has been ranked higher in the committee's eyes or whatever, and then Davis like whoops their butt the final week of the season, and then Sac still gets in over Davis. It feels like. I feel like there might be a little bit of pent up anger there, like wanting to prove like they belong, I guess.
Yeah, and hey, the attendance will be good at that game. That's been Sac State, in spite of sucking this year, their attendance has actually been pretty strong. You don't know that from streams just because of the location of the camera, but as an Eastern fan, you are quite aware of having the press box pick up the wrong side of the field. I just think we covered Davis already. We think they're better than they're trending upward, right? Like they've been good all year, but they're trending upward. When I 100% acknowledge and accept your point about Davis has the ability to show up flat, Sacs also, they're trending downward. And as you alluded to, Sac State's pretty good at losing games for themselves in ways they probably shouldn't, or needing some help to pick up. Like they needed a Weber to miss a field goal to have the single Big Sky win that the Hornets have. So I agree with you that I think is probably going to be closer than you might guess for a half, but I think it's going to end in a multi-score win for UC Davis, and then we'll be talking playoff stuff for Davis. We already talked Montana State. So unless you want to talk Northern Colorado, Portland State.
That seems like a very Big Sky Podcast Network Power Rankings show thing to do. We didn't really talk about Montana State, Montana. We kind of just brushed over like this game won't be close.
Well, no, we hit it right after where we said like, hey, this is what it means to these two teams.
Right.
Look, if Montana picks up a win, that's honestly like they might ratchet back up into the discussion of do they get a first round bye because at 9 wins with a win over Montana State. And that would be the marquee win. The Grizz don't actually have a fantastic win on the resume. Like their best win is over Missouri State earlier this season. I just feel like, and we covered the resume for Montana State early. Like it's 1 or 2. That's it. I don't know. I'm just not. I think the matchup is atrocious for Montana State for every reason you talked about in Idaho State, where like, hey, like some of the higher scoring pass friendly teams, like they can struggle with teams that can play defense and run the ball. Well, that's this matchup to a T, right?
Yep.
So
I hate this matchup for Montana.
Yeah. So, hey, we have blown through this without hitting a couple ad reads. So before we talk some of the other playoff stuff, and of course we're at 52 goddamn minutes already. Snake River Stampede Canadian whiskey, 3-grain whiskey, one of the best buys in Idaho State liquor stores. Your Snake River Stampede is 80% corn, 10% rye, 10% malted barley. It's also got a double barrel finish to impart extra flavoring. It starts in first fill bourbon. It's finished in ex Oloroso sherry casks. Absolutely one of the best buys in Idaho State liquor stores. Grab yourself Snake River today. I think we can say for our NAU fans, we put to bed the NAU scenario. They got the help they needed from East Tennessee State and Chattanooga losing this last week. NAU needs to pick up their win. They're going to now, hey, regardless, if NAU gets in, they're probably one of the last 4 in. So NAU, there's no discussion about NAU in any sort of seed. And to my knowledge, with how the committee changed stuff this year, because they're going to seed 16 teams, that will just tell you if NAU makes the playoffs, they're on the road, correct?
Yeah. I mean, they'll be on the road pretty much for sure, unless absolute chaos happens this final week.
Yeah, because if 16 teams are seeded and all seeded teams host, well, 8 get buys and 8 are playing the first round. So 8 in the first round should be the home teams. So there's no world where NAU is going to be a home team, but NAU making the playoffs under first-year coach Brian Wright is a huge, huge step for the Lumberjacks. So if they get that, that's big. Montana, I think you and I are both on the same page of Montana's probably not hosting. And even if we hit a second ago, but even if Montana beats Montana, they're not host. Sorry. If Montana may have a chance to host in the first round, Montana is very likely not going to skip the first. They'd have to beat Montana State to have a prayer of skipping the first round. I don't think they're going to. But the Grizz are in that scenario where they kind of need some of the better teams to lose. Now, the Grizz have got to be able to host, the first round. Now, the Grizz have gotten some of that help in teams like Tarleton State picking up losses, teams like Abilene Christian recently having picked up losses. There's actually been a handful of teams in that 10 range that have picked up losses over the last couple of weeks. But I think that we just kind of know where Montana is playoff-wise.
Right. They'll be on the back end of the seed. I think they're going to be on the back end of the top 16 seeds. When you look at this playoff field, you get to the back 10 teams and you're like, man, these resumes aren't that good. There's very few quality wins in the FCS this year. So like Montana's win over Missouri State is actually not that bad of a it's a decent win. If Northern Arizona makes the playoffs, that win over Northern Arizona actually looks like one of their higher quality wins on the season. The caveat with Montana is they have two pretty damn bad losses between Weber State and North Dakota. So,
Well,
they're
relatively bad losses. Like they're still
Yeah.
Big Sky and Missouri Valley losses. North Dakota is not a catastrophe. Like they're ranked for a good amount of the year. They're just not good.
right, but for a top 16 team to lose to those two squad, it is a bad loss in relation to being a top 16 seed. When you look at the other teams, like they're I guess what they have going for them is they haven't lost games.
Actually,
Like they're just beating bad teams.
Actually,
like
you know
everyone in that
what?
range.
I got to go back. I absolutely have to go back on what we said because we're talking based off resume stuff, which I think is not irrelevant. But if you look at what Montana's actually done this year, hey, on that October 30th ranking, Montana was number 10.
Yeah.
And the grid, it's like your math is going to be like, okay, is a competitive loss. And I know like it was 30-14, but the game against Davis was competitive. Your question is, will competitive losses to a competitive loss to Davis and a potential loss to Montana State, will that knock them down 7 spots?
See,
I don't know if it will.
Should it? Probably. That plus, if you're picking up 2 late conference losses plus the Weber loss plus the North Dakota loss, that's a lot of losses.
Right, but it'll be 2 losses since the ranking. Two of the top 4 or 5 teams. I think style points actually might matter for the Grizz this week as far as what we're talking about. But Craig Haley at the Analyst has Montana slotted at the 9 seed right now,
which is
now.
Nuts.
I think it's nuts, but I don't think Craig Haley is completely disconnected from what the bracket's actually going to be. So even if you throw in some plus or minus here, I think that maybe that's actually more Montana at 10 or 11. So would a lot, and like we covered, Montana did get some help from those teams behind them picking up losses that are significantly worse losses than losing to Davis and losing to Montana State. So I'm going to backtrack. I'm going to say, I think Montana's easily probably in the playoffs, and maybe they're closer to 15 seed. But actually, I think your safest money would be Montana's going to be they'll be hosting a game.
So when I look at their resume, I think they're right on the bubble of that top 16 seed range. But Montana always gets the benefit of the doubt when it comes to when they're on that margin. I've noticed a couple years ago they shouldn't have been a playoff team, and they got in right at they were the last team in, and they hosted a game because that's how that worked. Then I have a feeling that they're going to get a top 16 seed. I think the brand is going to have if you're choosing between them and Tarleton State for one of those last couple spots, or them and Eastern Kentucky for one of those last right at that 16 spot, you gotta think they're gonna give it to the Grizz. The eye test probably gives it to the Grizz, and they've played a much tougher schedule than all of those teams. So another team that's right there with them is SEMO, who lost to Lindenwood, which is
an example of help potentially for a team like Montana. Now SEMO was above Montana in the rankings, so they're probably not. It would be weird for them to slam that far. It'd be weird for them to not just be essentially neck and neck with Montana to me, even if Montana loses. But I don't know. You actually covered it earlier. You said earlier, teams don't actually have as many quality wins as you might guess. And Montana, by being in the Big Sky, even okay wins for Montana can become good wins. Hey, NAU's top 25. That's a good win now, right? So NAU and Missouri State are two solid to good wins. That, depending on what your conference is, your conference might not even give you a shot to get 2 good wins. So okay, I think we've hit the Grizz and we're in an hour, so we have to talk I think we can almost talk about, we don't need to talk about Montana State. We already know they're going to be one. If they win, they're going to be 1 or 2. If they lose, they'll probably be 3 they'll probably be like 3 or 4, something like that. So Idaho was number 7 on the October 30th ranking, below Southeast Missouri State. And hey, Idaho's not going to touch North Dakota State, Montana State, South Dakota State, or UC Davis. So like, hey, those 4 are untouchable. The question for Idaho is, hey, you have to put them in at least 6 now, which then does beg the question when South Dakota presumably loses to South Dakota State this week. Could Idaho jump to number 5, Patty?
I think they probably should. If you match, so the 3 teams that I think are in conversation for, 5, 6, 7 right now are Mercer. You got Mercer, you got South Dakota, and you have Idaho. And of those 3 teams, I think the best resume is hands down Idaho. Idaho has an FBS win. Idaho has 2 top 25 or playoff team wins.
Okay, I'm going to jump into
matters
just because we talked about injuries for Idaho. If you're new to this, the playoff committee is not simply slave to rankings. Like it's a combination of rankings plus eye test, plus they get to factor in how injuries impact the team earlier in the year and currently impact the year. Idaho, I think, is a team where like injuries, though they suck to go through, they should help Idaho with seedings in both directions because Idaho picked up wins with injuries, but now they're also getting healthier and playing some of their best football at the time that really matters to close out the schedule. Back to you.
Right. So Idaho has the 3 pretty quality wins. Their losses are to number 1 FBS, probably number 2, either number 1 or number 2 FCS, and then number 4 FCS. Which,
if you're not familiar with the schedule, that's University of Oregon's the number 1 FBS, and the other losses are at Montana State. They got their ass kicked, but it was at Montana State with the 3rd string quarterback, and 2nd and 3rd throughout that game, and then at UC Davis in a tight game with a backup quarterback.
Yep, and then you have quality losses is annoying. I don't like quality losses, but the losses are of high quality for Idaho. The 3 losses are.
They shouldn't hurt. Like they don't make you think Idaho sucks that they lost these games.
Right. Then you have, they have the 8 wins that you need. If they beat Idaho State, they have 9 wins. You have an FBS win. You have 2 wins over playoff teams. Then you look at Mercer. Mercer has a very poor strength of schedule, which actually is probably boosted up quite a bit by playing Alabama last week. All of their quality wins, none of them made the playoffs, or none of them will make the playoffs come playoff time, most likely because Chattanooga lost. They're probably out of the playoffs. ETSU lost. They're probably out of the playoffs. Western Carolina, Cole Gonzalez got hurt. They lost. They're probably out of the playoffs. Those were their 3 kind of marquee wins this year that were kind of what they were kind of putting that was supposed to be their resume. And all those teams have turned out to be not very good. They turned out to be okay, like solid, but all those losses don't look nearly as good now. Now they play Furman. I don't think they have another opportunity to really.
And Mercer was below Idaho on October 30th. Yep. Mercer has done nothing to explain why they'd vault Idaho, and Idaho has not lost since those rankings were put out. So I don't think there's any discussion about a team below. If you're ranked below, below meaning worse, higher meaning number than Idaho on October 30th, there's no case to vault Idaho. It's more the South Dakota Idaho question. Right. And I think the thing that we're looking at, and hey, was hit in the comment section, Super George 111. South Dakota has a D2 win and a canceled game. Now, will the committee give any credit served, you might say, for that Portland State game being canceled? Maybe. But you play the games you play, and Idaho's going to finish with they should finish with 1 more win than South Dakota. And you should think of that as, like Super George said, like kind of like a win and a half more, because South Dakota's D2 win, it's a win, but it's not valued as much as an FCS win. So you have those demerits. And then, like, as you referenced, like, I mean, South Dakota, weirdly, actually, some of the losses are what helped South Dakota hang in very tough with South Dakota State. That slams that eye test up, I think.
Yep.
To give you the credit for South to help, explain why. And hey, that actually might explain the rankings on October 30th. That game took place on October 26th. So it was like your most recent sample of evidence. Since then,
they have 0 wins over playoff teams. And they have only 7 Division I wins after they lose to North Dakota State next week.
Yes. So, hey, to me, like, it should be, if South Dakota loses to North Dakota, look, if South Dakota beats North Dakota State, obviously you put them above Idaho because that's a huge one. If South Dakota loses, as everyone in the world is going to expect to happen, I think you would have to say there is some sort of just freakish eye test going on in South Dakota to explain why a team with a worse resume, plus the fact that Idaho's playing their best football now that they have the offensive, they have Jack Lane back at quarterback. You'd have to just have fallen in love with South Dakota for the eye test, I think. Otherwise, I think the jury's in whether you're going strictly resume or also eye test. Idaho has no prayer to get in at 4 if Davis wins, but Idaho should be 5, assuming chalk happens this week.
Right. And I think, like, should Mercer jump Idaho? Probably not. I don't think they should. I think it's more likely that Mercer jumps Idaho than South Dakota at this point, just because they'll have probably 10 wins at that point, which it does hold some weight. The thing is, they have a bad loss to Samford. I think personally, if I'm the one making the 8 seeds on Selection Sunday, Idaho is the 5. If they win this game this week, Idaho should be the 5 seed, which sets up UC Davis and Idaho a potential rematch in the quarterfinals, which would be fun.
Which is, hey, now we can talk Davis, but I think it's simple for Davis. They're not going to be one of the top 3. There's no case for them to jump They lost Montana State. There's no reason to say why you'd say Davis now jumps North Dakota State or South Dakota State. There's every reason to say why I think that Davis, who, again, when these initially happened, Davis was 5, South Dakota was 4. I think brain dead Davis has jumped South Dakota State. But I think that's just kind of where Davis is. I don't think there's much movement there. Now I will say, like, hey, Craig Haley has South Dakota 4, Davis at 5. But I gotta tell, I mean, I don't know, man.
The resume isn't there, but the eye test kind of is. Like, South Dakota has played some of the best teams in the country really close. But I mean, like, in like the North Dakota like score looked like they beat North Dakota at the Orlera Center 42-36. It's kind of like an Idaho thing where, like, they had like a 2-3 possession lead and then like late garbage time touchdowns made it look close. Like, South Dakota has looked like a top 5 team in the country, like eye test wise. They have. It's just their resume is so far from that it has to hurt them at some point. Like, I think if I'm power ranking those top 5-6 teams, I bet I'd put South Dakota at 4. But this isn't a power ranking. This is supposed to be more of a resume based. The resume is supposed to have more impact than the power ranking side of things when it comes to making these top 8 seeds. And I think it's just, I think the top 3, the Big Sky are what they are. If we see chalk this weekend, it's more of a question of, does NAU get in, and where the heck does Montana kind of slide out? And that's kind of hard to predict anyways.
Yeah, so before we get our closing points, show sponsor Hughes River Expedition. If you're looking for a great all-inclusive week-long vacation, don't look past your backyard. Hughes River Expeditions has been Vandal-owned and operated since 1976 and are ready to take you on the vacation of a lifetime. Enjoy a multi-day trip down the Middle Fork of the Salmon, the main Salmon River No Return, the Salmon River Canyons, or the Selway, and check out special trips like the one to see the Perseid Meteor Shower. Camp on pristine beaches, run amazing whitewater, hike scenic trails, spot wildlife, soak in beautiful natural hot springs, and fish some of the most remote stretches of river in the country. So grab paddle, catch dinner, ride the bull all throughout the Gem State. Call them now at 406-540-4450 or check them out at hughesriver.com. To close it out, we're going to just talk about, just say the 5 teams and where we think they're going to, that we've talked about, and say where we think they're going to wind up, and we're going to call that good. listeners, we talked about the case for, we didn't label it the case for and the case against, but that's what we did for a while. We're at an hour 10 on what is always supposed to be a 35-minute show, which is just never going to happen. There's too many teams to talk about. NAU, in or out? That means that implies you're picking the game. NAU, in or out?
I think Eastern wins the game, but I'm also biased as heck. If you're looking at this non-biased, I think you absolutely pick Northern Arizona. I'm biased. I think Eastern has a chance to win this game. I think they have some momentum. So I'm going to pick Eastern, and I think NAU gets knocked out of the playoff picture personally.
So Patty says NAU's out. I'm going to say I think NAU's in. I think it'll be tight, but I think NAU's in. I think they got the luck that they needed elsewhere. And NAU has not been a team that beats themselves, let's say.
Yeah.
Montana, in or out, hosting or not?
They'll be in. I think they will be hosting. I think they're going to be, middle between 10, 16. You know what would be really interesting is if they ended up at the 12, and then we have a quadrant with Montana, UC Davis, and Idaho all in the same quadrant. That would be really fun. But I think they'll end up, I'll say 13.
Okay. So you've got Montana in, and if Montana is 13, the winner of that plays your 4 seed, which could be Davis. So, Montana's in and they host. I have no idea how to say where they're going to be ranking wise, but I think what you said, somewhere between like 12, 14. I think that's fair. Idaho. Look, they're going to beat Idaho State. So I think you and I, we would both pick Idaho over Idaho State today. So Idaho, what's their seed?
I think if Idaho, I think style points might matter just a tad in this one. Like if it's an ugly win and the Vandals have to come back late or something, I could see him slip into the 6. But I think the resume is so much stronger than those other teams that are in there that Idaho they're going to end up with the 5.
Yeah, part of me says they're going to finish with the 6, but also optics wise, I know that losing to South Dakota State shouldn't really hurt you, but I think it absolutely helps Idaho that their losses came early and with injuries, not late and with whoever you got. That's who's probably playing in a couple weeks. So I think Idaho, if they win, are screwed if they get 6, although still it doesn't change that much. But I, as a Vandal, I want Idaho at 5 because I want Idaho matched up with the winner of the 4 seed, assuming Idaho wins their first round matchup. UC Davis, where they finish?
I think Davis is the 4. I think this is probably actually I think Davis at the 4 is the easiest one out of all of these to pick.
Yep, yeah, I think it should be a slam dunk. I think Davis is the 4, and now you got to pick Montana State. Are they 1 or 2?
I honestly think they might get the 1 seed. I honestly think if they really put it to Montana this week, I genuinely think there's a chance that they jump North Dakota State. The main thing that changes doesn't really imply anything with the Big Sky. It mostly just changes who Montana State would be hosting in the quarterfinals. It would set up the Dakota Marker in the FCS semifinals, Dakota Marker rematch in the semifinals. But I just think they have the better resume. They've looked like they have not played a game competitively against anyone this year. It feels like. I mean, they other than top 5 competition in a game versus an FBS school where they turn the ball over 3 times. I think Montana State's the 1.
I think I'm with you. I think they should be the 1, but here's the other optics thing too, is North Dakota State, if they finish with a win over South Dakota, which they should, then North Dakota gets to also have the style points thing going on objectively. Closing with a win over South Dakota is a more impressive win than closing with a win over Montana. And I do think North Dakota State looked pretty good in their 1 loss this year at Colorado, a game. Honestly, North Dakota State should have won that game. I watched it. I hate watched Colorado for that game. So I look, hey, I'm with you. On paper, all those things to me point Montana State, but I'm going to go back to on October 30th, NDSU is 1, And NDSU has done nothing to hurt their standing. If anything, that they're like Montana State. They've done a lot to show themselves as being very good. So I think you're right about the committee. I just think North Dakota State's going to finish number 1. Montana's going to be 2. Will it be because of the potential rematch of the Dakota Marker in the championship? Look, I don't think that's irrelevant, but I don't think it's necessarily that much. I truly think Montana State and North Dakota State, it's like a 52-48 as far as why you would say which team is number 1 and which team is number 2. I don't disagree at all with the argument for Montana State at number 1, but they also weren't number 1 earlier, and North Dakota State did nothing to lose it. So we're an hour 15 minutes, dude. We got to call tonight. Patreon.com/Tubs the Club to support the show. If you're a Vandal, I don't know why you could possibly not be part of our #OnlyTub Discord yet. But also, like, hey, if you're just a Big Sky fan, there's a lot of Big Sky football talk. Patty's an honorary Vandal because he went to Idaho for a couple of years, but at his heart, like, you can see that flag behind him. He's an Eastern Eagle. Patty still finds value in the Discord, so I think you could too. Patreon.com/Tubs at the club. We're gonna call it a night. Patty, any final parting words?
No, man. I'm just hoping that Eastern could get a win this weekend. I think it'd be great to be a playoff spoiler, and I think it might be Coach Best's last game on the sidelines. And if that's so, dude, Eastern's gonna be playing their butts off for that guy. So that's all I got. Go Eagles.
With the other thing being cathartic, catharsis can help and hurt. It's. Phil Jackson, basketball coach, famously didn't push his teams to run on anger just because he thought like that emotion was too volatile and you have a risk of running out. So I don't disagree with your point, but like to me, if the emotion is part of what's pushing the team, they need to get to a big lead, because if emotion keeps them close, it will drain them at the end. So whatever, we have talked so much Eastern compared to what that team has, but whatever. Thanks for showing up, guys. Everyone in the comment section, thank you. And you know what? We're going to call it a night. See you guys later.